So normally we do this just as a normal live stream, but we've opened the doors up a tiny bit today to have a little select crowd in.
Very select.
Very select. If you are new to our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe. It all helps us grow the channel. And also, if you haven't bought in for the concert later, PayPal me /Mood Indigo Events, and you can buy the concert that follows the chat after. Janet McCunn is here, and she will give you the link. She's manning the iPad. Is it today?
Yeah.
So Jim, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Terry. Nice to be here.
Shall we start off with how you got into? Well, no, wait. Where are you from? Whereabouts?
Well, I'm from the East End of Glasgow.
Okay.
It's a very good place to come from. Apart from fighting off gangs and trying to stay alive, it was actually quite a good place for music. There were lots of local bands, and one of my claims to fame is that I was in the local skiffle group when I was about 8 years old. I played the tea chest bass, which is literally a tea chest with a broom handle in one corner and a bit of string nailed in one corner and tied around the top. And you get different notes by pulling the broom handle back and plucking it. You got a kind of facsimile. It's very primitive, but there were people blowing into jugs, and a drummer who had no drums with just sticks, who would play on any surface available. You know, this is the kind of culture that I grew up in. You know.
Brilliant.
But anyway, as far back as I can remember, the radio was always on in the house, and my mum used to sing along with all the songs, and it was Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and Dick Haymes and Tony Bennett, and much later when I got involved in jazz, I kind of half knew those songs through osmosis, that they had just kind of sunk in through my psyche.
Right.
So when I started playing standards, which is what these people were singing, they were the pop songs of the 40s and 50s. I kind of felt I kind of had a way in because my mum was always singing these songs around the house, you know.
Yeah.
And she told me a story later, not long before she passed, that she used to offer to read me a story in bed when I was a kid, and I'd say, "No, can you sing me a song?" So she would sing me. I'd ask her to sing me a song. I had no memory of this, but because she was always singing, I was very used to hearing her sing. So, in fact, my mum, if she walked into an event or something, somebody gave her a mic, she'd start singing. She didn't need accompaniment or anything. She would just jump right in there. Anyway, yeah, that was my starting point. But we lived in tenement buildings in Glasgow, and the place I grew up has all been flattened. It doesn't exist anymore. But in the next close, there was an older friend of mine. He was about 14 or 15. I'd be about 8. And he had an archtop guitar, the first archtop guitar I ever saw. And that's a jazz guitar. That's the one that has a curved rather than a flat top. And I used to go and knock on his door and ask if I could look at his guitar. I never dared to ask if I could touch it, you know.
Wow.
And eventually we became kind of pals.
Sorry, 1 second. Can you not walk in front of the camera? Sorry, that'd be great. We've got a brand new member of Bar Stuff tonight, and he's yeah.
It's all right. Carry on. You're doing a great job. So where were we?
Yeah. The guitar.
Oh yeah, the older friend who had an archtop guitar, and he also was a jazz fan. He already was into jazz. He'd be about 15 or 16. And at that time in the UK, you could only get jazz records from the west coast of America.
Okay.
For some reason, all the East Coast labels like Riverside and Blue Note were not coming into the country. Only the West Coast ones, which were coming out of Los Angeles, and that was contemporary and Pacific jazz. And that was from the musicians who were in Los Angeles, because that was the home of the movie industry. And they were working on movies. They were contracted to film companies and making soundtracks for movies. So whenever you looked at the back covers of Barney Kessel or Tal Farlow or Bud Shank or any of those guys, they were all wearing Hawaiian shirts, you know. They'd come straight from the beach, you know. I mean, these guys were not having social problems. They weren't living in kind of projects or anything, you know. They were living the great life. And I loved those records. My first exposure to to jazz. In fact, when my older friend John, played them to me, as a 9 or 8-year-old kid, I had no idea what I was listening to. In fact, I think I said to him, "Is this music from Mars?" It might as well be, because I had no understanding of what was going on. He was playing Charlie Parker records and all this fast stuff, and the only thing I could really hear was the bass part. And in fact, I became a double bass player. That was my entry to jazz, because the bass players were only playing 4 notes in the bar, and everybody else was playing 8, 16, or 32. So that was my kind of easy option, was to play the fewest number of notes. But anyway, that was my kind of start off. Really, I was introduced by an older friend. I think, like most people, an older friend introduces you to something, and something connects. And I kept coming back and bugging him and saying, "Can I hear those records again?" He'd say, "No, I'm with my girlfriend, go away."
Yeah.
But occasionally he'd say, "Okay, come in." And he'd play me again some of those records, and something really connected. And I think I still feel that kind of sense of wonder with jazz, because of all the contemporary musics, I think it's the most challenging, because there is no set plan. It's what can you come up with at that moment in time. I love the challenge of that. And while it is a challenge and it can go wrong, you can not rise to the challenge. It's a part of the same process, but the challenge is there, and that's the important part. You have a challenge to meet, as opposed to just going through the motions of something else. So then, when I became a teenager and I was playing double bass with little local bands and things, Jazz at the Philharmonic used to come to Glasgow. Now, Jazz at the Philharmonic, for anyone who doesn't know about it, was this promoter, Norman Granz, who brought state-of-the-art jazz to the provinces. They came to Glasgow every year. I believe they came to Newcastle, Manchester, and it was Count Basie Orchestra, Duke Ellington, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald. I saw 3 times, I think. And I remember seeing Freddie Green, the guitarist in the Basie band. He was playing an acoustic guitar. And this is 16 brass, all blasted. You could always hear Freddie. He was the sound monitor. He'd be... You could always hear him, And I think in the Basie band, if you couldn't hear Freddie Green, something was wrong. Basie would say, "Hey!" and tell them all they're playing too loud or something. But it was a fantastic, because there were 16 guys that played like a quartet. And I heard them in a cinema in Glasgow. They didn't even have a proper concert venue at that time. But it didn't matter. They played so beautifully together, like a quartet, and the sound was wonderful. Whisper to a Scream. I also saw the Oscar Peterson Trio with Ray Brown and Ed Thigpen. A couple of times they came, and I'll never forget the excitement of that trio. What a band,
Yeah.
And this is when Oscar was at his complete, virtuosic best. But you couldn't take your eyes or your ears off of Ray Brown, because his bass lines were just so swinging and exciting, and his solos were so full of humour. And although Oscar was flying around double octave lines everywhere, something about the Oscar Peterson Trio was just so magical. You couldn't really get past them at that time. I'd be talking about late 50s, early 60s. And anyway, and then all things like the MJQ, and also I saw John Coltrane in Glasgow.
Oh, wow.
When I think just after my 16th birthday, playing at this place, the St Andrews Halls, which burnt down a week later. And people said it was because the Coltrane band lit so many fires with their music that the place just smouldered away until it burned down. But I never knew anything about John Coltrane when I went to the concert. He was opening for Dizzy Gillespie, and I'd gone along with my older friend, the guitar player from next door, to hear Dizzy Gillespie. And by this time in his career, Dizzy was kind of playing less trumpet and more of a showman.
Right.
It's like Ooshooby Dooby and all that kind of stuff, and playing the congas, which he didn't really play, but just that kind of conga playing, which all of us can do. And it was kind of slightly disappointing, but before Dizzy came on, the Coltrane Quintet with Eric Dolphy came on, and they only played 2 tunes in an hour. My Favourite Things and Naima. And I remember thinking, my God, what is this? But it was like, it was almost like kind of hypnotizing, I mean, the sort of mantra quality that they got going, that kind of wild African sort of 3/4 that they played on My Favourite Things.
Yeah.
And Elvin, you know, who was completely a different player with Coltrane. And I've heard him many times at Ronnie Scott's, but with Coltrane, he was on another level. It was absolutely amazing. And all the drummers in Glasgow, the St Andrews Halls was music in the round. All the drummers were behind Elvin on that part of the thing, you know. And apparently there was a huge pool of water when he finished playing, you know. I mean, I don't know where it came from. I guess he sweated a lot, right? But, you know, who knows? But anyway, I'll never forget that concert. I had no idea what was going on, but something, again, kind of transported me. And I think that's something I feel about jazz in many ways, that although I heard all those concerts, I can't remember anything that I heard on them. You know, I couldn't tell you a tune that they played, really, because I was just completely transported. And it's that thing where, of all the arts, music is the most abstract, because it's painting pictures and sound, you know. Somebody wrote a book called The Poetry of Tonality, and I think that kind of almost sums it up, that you're speaking poems and stories in music and tones. And I remember just being, you know, suddenly my horizons got bigger, accelerated, you know. I could see beyond the one I'd already seen, and suddenly there were other ones, you know. And I think that was part of the whole process that inspired me as a trainee journalist, which I was at that time, in a daily newspaper in Glasgow. Was to forget about the idea of being a journalist for my life, and maybe moving into something a little more creative, more exciting, and more fulfilling.
Yeah. So when you saw you first got into jazz and started going to these concerts at that venue, and were you already playing jazz at all then? Were you kind of still had you kind of been doing any gigs when that sort of time?
Yeah, with my friend next door, we used to practice a lot together, you know, and then we started getting little restaurant, you know, the things we all do, you know, coffee bars and restaurants and stuff.
Yeah.
And there would be him on guitar, me on double bass, and another older friend on piano. So it was like that kind of Nat Cole trio sort of lineup, which I still love that sound, actually, you know, the drumless trio with piano, guitar. And normally in an instrument, a trio, when you've got piano and guitar, the guitar is the rhythm guy, you know. They're hardly ever playing chords at the same time. I mean, you know, kind of comping chords at the same time, because you would get a lot of clashes. And I was fortunate in my later years to play with the great American pianist Gene Harris.
Yeah, great.
And Gene was one of the most exciting guys I ever played with. From beat one, he swung so hard that everything was just right off the floor, you know.
Yeah.
Ba, boo, ba, ba, you know, and everything's already happening, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, I loved playing with him, but he never ever told me what he was going to play. At first I thought, he's taking the mickey. You know, but then I spoke to Dave Cliff about this, and Dave said, no, man, he trusts you. He trusts that you'll do the right thing. It never occurred to me, you know, he might trust me, you know. I thought he'd be thinking, you know, this guy's terrible or something. But then getting to know him, and getting to know all the voicings that he used so that we never clashed. And then he got me into playing rhythm guitar. He got me into doing the Freddie, you know, the
Yeah.
You know, which I'd never done before. It never occurred to me to do that. I thought, hey, that's what old people did, you know.
Yeah.
Now I'm old people, I guess. You know. But it made me realise that at certain tempo, the rhythm guitar adds a sort of density to the groove, you know. If you're talking about Count Basie, it's the perfect example. It does. I mean, the guitarist is probably doing the fewest number of note changes from chord to chord as anyone else in the band.
Yeah.
But it does kind of cement, you know, especially if the bass is in two and the drummer's playing sort of brushes on the hi-hat or something. There's a chemistry there, you know. And Gene Harris made me aware of that for the first time, you know. So now I love playing Freddie Green style, you know. I'll happily do it at the drop of a hat. But before then, it never occurred to me. I thought you had to be an exciting, stabbing sort of. And that's all right too. But if you're with a piano player, you're going to create hell. The two of you all stomping all over the place. So
Yeah.
I've quickly realised what not to do. You know.
I heard a really good quote just a few days ago, actually, and it was somebody talking about the Freddie Green guitar
Yeah.
style, and somebody said it was felt but not heard.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, I mean, you could say that, but except he could hear it.
yeah,
And that's the amazing thing, because this is in the days before guitar amplifiers and electric guitars and all that stuff, you know. I know that Freddie played a big Stromberg, which was one of the huge bodies, I mean, much, much bigger than what I'm playing now, and wide and quite highly strung. And he never moved up here, and he never played a solo. He was always down here and all the really meaty kind of... But you could always hear him, you know, in a big band. If any of us tried to do that in a big band now, you never hear anything, you know. If I was trying to do this in a big band, might as well stay home, you know. But you could hear him, because the whole thing was so finely attuned. Somebody said to me, they often didn't know what countries they were in, but they knew what tune they were playing. And I was able to tour with Frank West's, the great tenor sax and flute player from the Basie band, towards the end of his life, and his stories were quite amazing, you know, but I won't go into them now because they're quite rude, some of them. But he said that whenever they tried a new arrangement, if it didn't work first time, they threw it in the bin. Because when these guys are on the road drinking and smoking and stuff, if it didn't work first time, it would be catastrophe on the road, you know. So although they didn't know what country they were in all the time, they knew how to play together.
yeah,
And I'll never forget that sound of these 16 guys, you know. And I remember I saw them in the cinema in Glasgow, and there were only 3 mics on stage. One on the piano, one for Basie to talk into, and one in front of all the horns, 3 rows, saxophones, trombones, trumpets. And the soloists all had to walk down. So they would have 8 bars to do it in at the end
Yeah.
of a sequence or something, walk down and take their solos into the mic. 3 mics. And the sound was fantastic, because these guys knew how to play together. They didn't need, you know, you go to a gig now and you look at the band and every instrument has a mic on it. You know, so you're depending on the guy mixing it. He hasn't got the first idea of how that band's going to sound. How is he going to mix 16 instruments? You know, he'd have to be a genius to do all that, you know. I've been very fortunate to get to play with the Georgie Fame big band, and the last gig we did, I think, was at the Cheltenham Festival a couple of years ago, and they had set up all the instruments with all these mics, and Georgie said, no, take all these away, we don't need them, you know. He was right, because in this big echoey, if you've ever been in the Cheltenham, you know, that big town hall area, I
Yeah,
mean, it's an
yeah.
echo chamber anyway, you know, so you know, by amplifying everything, you know, you create absolute acoustical horror. Anyway, Georgia got him to take it all away, and we played, and the sound was great. It was wonderful, you know. He knew better than the sound guy. It was probably some young rock guy desperate to turn everything up. So
yeah,
anyway, so that idea of being an ensemble player always appealed to me, you know.
yeah,
But the thing that really drew me in the first place was the emotional content of being, you know, hearing something and being stirred in such a kind of gut instinct, primeval way, you know. I've never been able to explain that, and that's why, as much as I love jazz and I love Celtic music, you know, I mean, I've learned a lot of bagpipe music on the guitar. It sounds great. You get all the drones in there, you know, the sort of... That's a bagpipe tune. It sounds great on the guitar, you know, but it's just... And also Italian opera, you know. I did a recording which I got a lot of flack for, of Puccini's Nessun Dorma,
oh
because I
wow,
always thought that sounded like a jazz tune, because it's got all those minor 9 chords, you know. You know, I mean, these are jazz chords. You know, this guy Puccini knew what he was doing. You know, and I just thought these are, you know, this is the kind of thing that jazz musicians just kind of grab onto, because when you hear those lovely big, sexy minor 9 chords, you're just dying to play something over the top of it. You know, at least I am.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was the emotional connection, and I still feel that very strongly. Although I'm still trying to figure out what the hell I'm doing. You know.
So the jump between bass, being a bass player in these groups,
Yeah.
and then to obviously becoming more of a guitar player, how did that come about?
Well, actually, I was a guitar player first.
Okay.
I mean, I'm talking about, you know, 8-year-old kid playing skiffle and stuff. You know, last train to San Fernando, last train to San Fernando. You know, all this kind of stuff. Lonnie Donegan, famous Glasgow
Yeah.
boy. You know,
Yeah.
what was his big one? Rock Island Line, yeah, you know, there was. This was when people were starting to realise that music was a much broader kind of picture than had already been thought of. You know, skiffle came out of the jug bands in America. You know, people blowing into bottles with water in them to get a note, and making your own instruments, and it was the start of a kind of revival of the folk music thing. I was very into Scottish folk music before I discovered Irish folk music, and Celtic and Welsh and Breton folk music, you know. And there's wonderful. In fact, I recorded an album about 20 years ago of the music of Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet.
Okay.
Everybody in the world knows Auld Lang Syne, right? You know, well, Auld Lang Syne was a poem of Burns, which he put onto an old. What he was doing actually was what jazz musicians do. Jazz musicians play those songs that come from shows that are long forgotten, Broadway shows. You know, nobody remembers the shows, but these songs are being kept alive by jazz musicians who are still playing them. Burns did a similar thing by taking all these ancient songs, which were for people who are long gone and there was no contemporary significance from, and he put his poetry to it. You know. And I love that idea. So I kind of did a little thing of my own, adding a little more harmony to some of the songs. But there's some really beautiful, haunting, you know. There's a song called I Fond Kiss, which is like, it means one fond kiss. And it's just play a little bit. These kind of things that kind of paint pictures and sound, you know, I love that idea, you know. So that was my kind of take on all that, yeah.
Great.
Sorry,
And
I
so
forgot what the question was.
So you were playing guitar before bass, and then
I was playing kid stuff on guitar,
Right.
skiffle stuff.
and that was all self-taught, or you and your friends
yeah,
just
there were no
working it out?
teachers actually when I
Yeah.
was a kid in Glasgow. There was one teacher, but I was scared to go to him because he was a kind of a stickler for correct technique and all that stuff. Now, to let you understand why I was scared to go to him, I'm left-handed, but as you can see, I'm playing right-handed. Now, this guy would have said, "Stop, turn the guitar round this way and get a pick," and you know, I mean, I would have given up. I would be a bus conductor now or something, you know. But then, I mean, holding a pick. The thing is about left hand and right hand and the way it works in the brain. All I remember is my handwriting fell apart, and I was getting hell from all my teachers at school. "Mullen, what's this? You call this writing?" And so, "Sorry, sir. You know, because I was playing the guitar, my left hand, which I always wrote with, was screwing up the electricity on the other side of my brain, and I shouldn't have been doing it, but I kind of persevered through it to the point. My handwriting has never recovered, by the way, but I persevered, and I couldn't do it the other way. But I used to keep dropping the plectrum, you know, and I'd be looking on the floor for it, you know. I couldn't see it. It just sort of carried on. I had no technique anyway, so I just carried on with the thumb. That felt more natural, you know, hey, etc. And that's a bad habit that never got fixed. Although the one guitarist in Glasgow who taught jazz, I much later got to know. His name was Ron Moore. He was a lovely guy, and he was he died when he was 91, and I used to go up every time I went to Glasgow to see my parents. I would go and see Ron, and he would take you into his music room, and you could not get out. He'd lock you in there, and you'd be in all day playing, East of the Sun. Da 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 dee, da 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 dee. He'd say, "Look, Ron, I've got to go and see him." No, just a couple more. He was like a kid. He was mad for it, And I kind of love him for that enthusiasm that just fires you up and makes you want to play music, because we all start out as kids wanting to play music. We want to get involved. If you like music, you want to play it. That's what your aim is, And dear old Ron, and I managed to persuade a small record label in Glasgow to record the two of us together as a duo. And we recorded a couple of Ron's tunes. He never made a record in his life. He'd done TV and radio and private recordings, but never. So he made a CD, and I remember him looking at it when he got it. He was so proud, and he got paid for it as well, which is very important. And we did it. He was very nervous in the studio because, you feel all the lights are on you, the cameras, a bit like now actually, And so I got it set up like his front room, with 2 chairs and a table with cups of tea and a plate of biscuits and things, So he felt kind of at home because he couldn't respond to the idea of, right, okay, let's do a take, 1, 2, It had to be on his terms, but he handled it great. He'd never done it before, and he did a great job. And I'm really proud I managed to get his one and only record made. And he brought along some old musician friends. We did a couple of gigs around the time of the release of that record, which was called El Rond. With Ron, Ron's name was in different coloured letters than the.
Oh yes, it stood out. Yeah.
So it stood out, and a picture of him with his Joe Pass Epiphone, smiling on the cover.
Oh, great.
And basically, he was a guitarist that came from that time when, nobody had really figured out all the arpeggiations of the chords. They had, they didn't run the changes. In other words, he's pre-bebop and all that stuff. These guys understood much more about harmony and could fly through all the changes and know all the, how to do that. Ron didn't do that. Ron was an improviser in the purest sense. That he just took the melody and embellished the hell out of it. That's what he did, and it sounded great. I was also able to play with who was the guitarist in the Fats Waller group? He was a little kid. He's on these soundies, and I've completely forgotten his name. I'm ashamed to say.
Anyone knows? Just type it in the comments.
I played with him at the Pizza Express, and he was like that. He didn't know anything about harmony, but he just played, and he had the most wonderful natural instinct for inventing melodies, and I love that. I love the fact that it's not a technical exercise. It's an instinctive, desire, obligation almost.
Yeah, fantastic.
So there's room for all of it, actually.
Yeah. So then going from kind of playing little, like your restaurant gigs, you were saying you were kind of doing the little with the trio. How did you then start to kind of do gigs under like with as a sideman or for as yourself, that were kind of like people coming to see you rather than a kind of functiony type gig?
Well, that's a good question actually, because I did start to think about composing. I'm completely self-taught, so the idea I had to buy a book to how you write music and all this stuff. You're really primitive. But there was a specialist record shop in Glasgow run by a guy called Clifford Stanton, and he used to get 2 copies of every Blue Note album, and I used to get some of them. And there was another guy, Elliot Meadow, who was the son of a High Court judge. He would buy one copy of every Blue Note record. He eventually went to America and became a producer for Milestone Records. But anyway, at that time I bumped into him in this shop, and I was buying Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Freddie Hubbard, Jazz Messengers, those kind of records, taking them home and trying to figure out what the hell is going on here, I loved it so much, but it was kind of a real challenge to hear what those guys were doing without there's no music available, of course. And I couldn't find a piano player who could play like that, you know. So that's when I changed from the bass to the guitar, because I could almost kind of comp like a piano player comps, you know.
Yeah.
Especially when they're playing all these big sort of suspended. All that kind of stuff, you know. So I became the guitar player in the band, and I get somebody else in to play my double bass. And then I found these two guys that I knew from Dundee that I'd played with before, Malcolm Duncan and Roger Ball, tenor
Right.
player and alto player, who later went on to form the Average White Band, another famous Scottish group. But for a while, for a year or two, we used to meet in Glasgow every week, and I'd found this venue, because what you had to do to get a jazz gig is you had to go around pubs and restaurants and things and say, what's your quietest night of the week? They'd normally say Monday or something like that. So I'd say, right, I've got a band that will come in and play here. And I was always in the area around the university because there's a lot of young people there, you know. So I found this place called the Long John Cafe in a basement in Gibson Street in Glasgow, up near the Queen Margaret University. And we started doing our weekly residency in there. And these guys would drive through from Dundee in Roger's wee Mini and drive back, because they were both at the Duncan Jordanson School of Art in Dundee. They had to be back in the morning. So they'd come through and then drive back. And we started out playing, you know, some Coltrane tunes and standards and things. And we ended up playing all original tunes. I started writing a few things, and Roger started writing, and it just kind of ballooned from there. Having a weekly place to play is a wonderful opportunity to do things.
What era would we be talking about? What kind of years would that be?
Okay, well, I moved to London in Christ.
69.
Sorry?
69.
69,
Yeah.
yes. I came down to London in 69 and joined a terrible rock band. I'm not going to mention who, but that was my foot in the door. And anyway, so this would be about 65, 66, something like this. And it really became very exciting, because, you know, I would maybe write a tune and they'd come in and we'd run it through before the gig. And it was only a wee coffee bar, but all of the students came down, and I think they paid about 2 shillings or something to get in. You know, so we weren't buying Ferraris or anything, you know, but we could probably afford to go out and buy a curry afterwards. That was about it. But just the thrill of having an opportunity to play to an audience and get some kind of feedback and feel as if you're starting to get a foot in the door of how to compose for a group. That was exciting. That was a kind of starting point. I mean, I think I was probably still doing bass gigs because I was known as a bass player as well.
Right.
And, you know, people would call me up to do TV and things. I'd still have my bass. Although Arnie Summergy's got it now.
Okay.
Although I gave it to him, but I think he did it up and sold it to a student or something. But anyway,
Right.
It was lying in the corner of one of my kids' rooms for years. I think it was in several pieces by this time, you know, because the glue becomes unstuck if it's not being played all the time, you know. So the neck came off and something. Anyway, it's in a good home now, I believe, you know. So it was just kind of really trying to understand, you know, more about the music and being inspired by all the new things that were happening in the 60s, you know, the Herbie Hancocks, the Wade Shorters, all the kind of major players who are still around today, to try to figure out what they were doing and to be inspired by it and try and make our own little. I think I remember taking the band into a little studio in Glasgow, probably around 65 or 66, to make a record. And it cost something like 10 quid for 3 hours or something like that. It wasn't breaking the bank, you know, and it wasn't a particularly great studio, but we recorded it. And I remember being so excited with this, you know, the 2 horns and the guitar, bass, drums thing. And all I've got, or I haven't got it, one of the other guys has got an acetate of this, you know. It never actually got pressed into vinyl or anything, you know. There was only this acetate. I don't think we could afford to get it done, but anyway, it was just very exciting to actually hear back what we had done and to feel that we were beginning to understand a little bit more about music, you know, how to make our own stuff, you know.
So you obviously were getting booked. You said you did some TV things, and other gigs. So at the time, you must have known that you're quite good at this music, Lark, and people are booking you. And were you doing it full time then at the time?
No, I was a journalist. I was working
Right.
for a daily newspaper as a sub-editor, a rewrite man.
Right. Yeah.
And people used to say, "What's a sub-editor do?" I said, "Well, you'd be given a story off the press, and it would be a plane crash. 20 people killed. One of them a Scot. This was the thing in Scotland. You had to get the Scottish thing. So the story would be 1 Scot amongst 20 dead in plane crash. So as a sub-editor, that would be your opening paragraph. Never mind the other poor 19 buggers, The Scot was the important. And then you would be given a typeface and you had to write a headline, And that's why when you see headlines, the words are all very short, because you've maybe only got 12 letters by 10 letters by 8 letters, and you've got to say something. That's almost impossible. So that's why you get all these cut, axe, bid, all the 3-letter words all come up, because that's all you can fit in those spaces. So I was doing that. And actually I did that when I was in the Daily Record. That's a daily paper. So you work the night before. So when I was in the Daily Record, the only nights I could play would be my 2 nights off. That would be Saturday, because the Sunday paper would be getting done then, and I wasn't involved in that. And then one other different night of the week, which you had to arrange with all the other guys in the editorial. So I only had 2 nights off a week. I'd try and get gigs for the Saturday, which I usually could do, and then another night as well, maybe a Friday, But then I moved from the Daily Record to the Evening Times. At evening papers, you worked more like office hours. Then I had every night free. So then I could work 7 nights a week if I wanted. So that's what happened. Plus my social life started improving, because when you work in the newspaper, the daily papers, you're a hermit. I was still living at home with my parents and my brothers, but I never saw them, because when I came back from work, they were asleep and they were away before I was, so you're a kind of hermit. But then the evening paper, everything opened up. I started doing many more gigs. And I actually, I was really enjoying playing with the band and doing other things. And then I got offered a gig in London playing with a group, a new rock band, And this is the beginning of the downfall. I had never played rock before, So I was buying all these rock records to figure out, what are these guys playing, all this. I very quickly realised they're just playing a few blues licks with the volume turned to 12, and distortion pedals and God knows what else, So that's quite easy. So I came down to this thing. I was also composing with this guy, and we were rehearsing. And I mean, the volume, I've got tinnitus from those days, That's the ringing in the ears thing, Still got it from those days. Playing through a Marshall stack, standing right next to it with the volume full on. Anyway, this was my way of getting into the London scene, I really wanted to play jazz, but I used to go along to some jazz venues and ask to sit in, but nobody would let you sit in because the scene was quite small. There were only a few gigs. I used to go along to the Bull's Head, and people like Tony Lee was playing there. I'd say, "Tony, can I sit in with the band and just play a song or two?" He said, "Do you know Terry Smith?" Yeah. I've not met him, but I know of him. So that was it. And plus I was starting to grow my hair, so they're very suspicious. Long hair, he's going to come in and play a Rolling Stones tune or something, So they wouldn't let me sit in, although I later got to know Tony Lee and all those guys very well and did gigs with them and stuff. But at those days, people were worried that you might steal their gig. So it was kind of very protected and a bit closed, not terribly open, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But that's all right. That's how it was.
So how did you get your kind of, what opened up in London then? Did you continue doing the rock stuff? Or?
Well, I mean, I did the rock stuff for a few years, but then I left. I was in a couple of bands. Then I joined Brian Auger's band. Now, Brian Auger was already a great jazz musician, jazz pianist. He became a great jazz organist, and he had a lot of success in America and throughout Europe. And I got the gig in his band. And that was a whole different ball game. I mean, Brian's a real player, very exciting, very swinging guy, and the straightest guy I ever worked for. I mean, he remortgaged his house to keep the band on the road and all this kind of stuff. He was completely dedicated, and very, very honest man and a great musician. And it was wonderful being involved with him. But he was asking me to do more than I could do at that time. He played very long pieces, very extended, a lot of demand for long soloing and things like that. I didn't have enough stuff to deal with that. You know, I could play little solos, but he wanted big, long, kind of epic sort of things. And I'm sorry, man, I can't do that. And I joined another band that was absolutely horrible. And
Can I ask, is it right to ask?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Were you reading at that time?
yeah, not very much, but a little,
Yeah.
because I'd been writing. So
Yeah.
I kind of learned to primitively write and read music, but I'm not a great reader. Most guitar players, how do you get the guitar player to turn down, hand them the score? You know, immediately they get very quiet. You know,
Somebody
I'm one of them.
somebody on YouTube says, was it Al Casey? The
Al
Fats Waller?
Casey was
Yeah.
Fats Waller's guitarist.
Yeah.
I did a couple of gigs with Al, and he was an absolute sweetheart. But he couldn't see, so he used to get me to fix up his amp and get the controls right for him. And I say, "Is that all right, Al?" I say, "Yeah, that's fine." And he would play something. He'd just call a tune Rosetta or something. He'd play, and he would just make these beautiful solos, but they were nothing to do with harmony. They were not running changes. They were just beautiful melodic inventions, which is what the first soloists did. Nobody knew about harmony in those days, you know. They just knew that you could embellish a melody and it would work. So you get little, you know, decorations on either side of a note, you know.
Beautiful.
But Al was a sweetheart. I'm very proud to have played with Al Casey, the guitarist from Fats Waller's band. He's on these old soundies, and he's like 16 years old or something. He's a little kid, you know. Fantastic.
Great.
So, and after, I think the turning point was when I met Dick Morrissey,
Mm.
the great English saxophone player who was never properly appreciated in his own country, but he was a fantastic musician. I mean, I wish I could have introduced him to Gene Harris, because the two of them together would have been a marriage in heaven. You know, both of them, I think, of all the musicians I've ever played with, had complete certainty in their own time feel. They could swing all by themselves, you know, with absolute certainty. And, you know, Dick never ever criticised, I never heard him criticise anything, but he was the most encouraging guy. And although he was up there and I was down here, he never ever criticised me or said anything negative. He was always encouraging. And that was my college education right there, because he would take the first solo, and I used to describe it as like, you know, carved from marble, you
Right.
know. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a monster player, you know, everything he played was fantastic. And he never took it easy. Everything was completely full on. And I used to analyse his solos, and they were the most beautiful melodic inventions, you know. They were melodies. He was creating beautiful melodies. I was twiddling about playing notes in the chords and stuff. He was creating beautiful melodies that stood outside all of that. And it was a real example that I had to raise the bar to try and get close to that. I'm not sure I ever did, but I certainly tried to, you know. And then when that band broke up, I started doing my own little bands.
Mm.
First quartets with piano, bass, drums, rhythm sections, and then organ trio. I've still got my organ trio with Mike Gorman on organ and Tristan Mayo on drums, and I'm still very happy to play with these great guys.
Yeah.
You know.
In fact, it's August the 15th, I believe. You were playing at River House
For
Barn.
your festival, that's
Yeah.
right. Thank you for the gig. That's
My
our
pleasure.
first gig, and God knows, you know, it's been tough through this lockdown, I'll tell you, you know.
Yeah. So the Morrissey band obviously was quite a successful band.
It was.
And,
I mean, it was a great band. It was a 6 or 7 night a week band. We were touring, working all the time, and the thing I liked about it was we got such a mixed audience. You know, I mean, it wasn't just young people. It was a kind of older people, all colours. We used to do a residency at the Half Moon in Putney, and you could look out at the audience and you see old black people, you know, young black people, old white people, young white people. It was great. I never had that experience in my life before, really, to play to such a mixed kind of crowd, and lots of young musicians that came up afterwards and wanted to talk to you. I mean, Dick and I had both been through the rock band thing and had decided no more, you know.
yeah.
He said to me, you know, he was touring America in an English band called If. It was one of those rock bands with a horn section. And he said that was a drinking band. I mean, they were all plastered, all day long, you know, especially on the road. You got a lot of time to kill, you know. So they're all in the pub and they're all knocking it back, you know. Dick told me that he used to drink a full glass of vodka during the drum solo. So you can imagine what the rest of the day was like, you know. But anyway, he told me that they were in New York playing at some big rock thing, and he went along to the Village Vanguard, and Phil Woods was playing, the great alto player, and he went, this is what I should be doing. You know, he realised this is his music, and of course he knew it. He knew that music completely well. He was a great jazz player before he ever joined a rock band, and he said, right, that's it. I had a similar kind of epiphany, if you like, with the band I was in. I thought, no, bugger this, I'm off, you know. And we got together and we read each other's minds. You know, I got his phone number from the guys in the Average White Band. They actually helped to bring us together, because the Average White Band, who were all old Scottish friends of mine, and their success was worldwide. You know, they'd moved to America. They signed to Atlantic Records. They had a worldwide hit with "Pick Up the Pieces." They toured the world, blah blah blah. And the tenor player Malcolm Duncan, who was an old friend of mine from Dundee, phoned me up and said, "You fancy coming to New York and doing an album with Dick Morrissey?" I was like, I don't know Dick Morrissey. Well, here's his number. And it turned around, he was living about 3 blocks from me, you know, in Tooting. I was living in South Wimbledon at that time. So we met in a pub, and over a pint of Guinness, Dick said all the stuff I just said to you. I'm finished with rock bands. I've had it. I want to play some swinging, you know, happening music. He said, you know, I don't mind if it's got a backbeat to it. You know, and he mentioned, like, you know, people like Stanley Turrentine, the Crusaders, you know, the CTI label, which was quite successful at that time. Yeah. George Benson was on it. And they were making jazz records essentially with a kind of funky or backbeat rhythm, which gave it accessibility to a non-jazz audience. And I said, yeah, right. You know, so he said, Malcolm Duncan's invited us to go to Atlantic and record. So that was already putting us, you know, I mean, they were terrified of going to New York. And they had originally booked people like Steve Gadd and Chuck Rainey and all these sort of, so we were terrified, you know, never having played this music in a band. But anyway, we got together and I was crashing on the floor of this guy's flat in Wimbledon. I had a few tunes and Dick had a few tunes, and I had no gear. I was at my lowest ebb at that time. I had a guitar and a suitcase. That was it. So I'd gotten a hold of one of these little pig nose battery amplifiers. Do you remember them? Mm-hmm. And with a sort of 3-inch speaker in it or something, you know. So that was my gear, and Dick brought his tenor around, and we tried those tunes. And Dick's tunes were much more exciting and happening than mine, so that was all great. Mine were a little dodgy, but he was very nice about it. He said, yeah, we can make this work. So we had about 8 or 9 tunes, and we went to New York with these tunes, terrified that they wouldn't work with a band, you know, because it's another thing, you know, will everybody get it, you know, will we find the right groove, etc. Anyway, we'd had a little run through. The Average White Band had just finished. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, we're doing together.
As you can tell, I don't have a stop button. But the Average White Band had just finished doing their new album at Atlantic Studios in New York. And we were all invited round to Malcolm Duncan's house in Connecticut. And he had a studio in his basement. And the whole of the Average White Band came down, plus me and Dick. And I had scribbled out a little chord sequence for these songs and photocopied it. And we rehearsed it with these guys. And everything worked great. I couldn't believe it, you know. And I thought, oh my God, this is all, I can't quite believe this is all happening, you know. So I took it all back, got the tapes, timed everything, you know, and then realised how many choruses we could get in order to make 2 sides of a vinyl album. This is pre-CD, by the way. And we went into the studio. It was Atlantic Studios, 59th Street in Columbus. And the engineer was Gene Paul, Les Paul's son. He'd been there for yonks. And we met all the hierarchy of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun, Nesui Ertegun, Arif Mardin, all this kind of Turkish aristocrats who started Atlantic Records, you know, before they were taken over by the mafia. And that's when Atlantic Records became a rock and roll company. And it wasn't Ray Charles and John Coltrane, it was the Stones and the Who and all that stuff, you know. The mafia have a big hold in the music business to this day. Anyway, we got our thing in before that all happened, you know, and that we were over the moon. We couldn't believe it, you know, and the executive producer of the album was Herbie Mann, who Dick and I went on to work with after that in his band. And Herbie said, listen, your music's great, but you've got to get some vocals on there. You won't get any daytime radio play if you don't get vocals. But he said, but it's an instrumental band. I mean, just get some in to sing kind of backing hooks and things like that, you know. He said, leave it to me. So we'd recorded the music already. He said, right, come on, we've got a session tomorrow. And he got these singers in, and it was Luther Vandross, Cissy Houston, Whitney Houston's mum. In fact, she brought along a young girl with her. I think it was Whitney came along to our session. Myrna Shimwell. They were all huge people, by the way, enormous, eating triple Big Macs and, you know, and double milkshakes and all the wrong stuff, you know. They should have been on sort of vegan bars. Anyway, and another singer, I can't remember. And they came in and, you know, I thought, what are we going to tell these people? You know, it's really nervous. And Herbie said, don't worry, they'll be fine. And the first song was a thing of mine called Footloose. And Cissy said, Footloose, what does that mean? And I said, well, it's like, you know, you're ill at ease, you're uncomfortable, you know, you don't know what to do and all that. You know, the thing started and I had a kind of riff that went like, ba-do-dee-do-dee-do, ba-do-dee-da, like that, you know. And then they started saying, Footloose, can't get myself together. It was like a gospel choir, you know, and they just took off and everything they sung was fantastic. You know, I was like hair up at the back of my head, and it was like this the whole session. We kept every note that they sung. And there was another thing where there was a breakdown suddenly, and there was just this little piano riff that carried on before it all picked up again. And Luther and Cissy started doing this gospel kind of moaning and wailing. Ooh! I mean, it was absolutely incredible. It was uncanny. But this is how these people worked. They were like the top session singers in New York at that time. Their instincts were so highly attuned to everything.
Did that stuff sort of just happen, or was one of them like arranging?
No, it just happened. They picked up instantly. They were improvisers, you know.
But in harmony.
In harmony. They would sing it in unison to begin with, and then they would harmonise it the next time. So it was incredible. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Cissy Houston was still running, I think she is to this day, running the gospel choir in her church in East Orange, New Jersey. Dick went out to that church to hear her, actually, told me all about it, says it was incredible. It's the greatest vocal training ground I think there is, you know. And they were just wonderful, absolutely wonderful, you know. And, you know, Herbie was right, it did get daytime radio play, you know. You have to have that. Because in America, it's like that here now as well, actually, but all the radio stations are formatted. You have to have something that fits the format. You only have to listen to what's going on in Jazz FM these days to hear how unrelated it is to anything that we do. Anyway, that's another story, but...
That's great. That's a great story.
Yeah.
So after that very successful band, obviously you wanted to do stuff and move on and do your own projects under your own name.
Yeah, which I did. I mean, there's a lot of albums, but nobody knows about. My records don't get reviewed. You know that? We send them out to all the people, but they're not really interested, actually. They'd rather write about some American or some, you know, Chinese jazz violinist or something. I mean, they're not very interested in the local lads, you know. I regard myself as a long-term resident down here as a local lad. They don't review my records. You send them out, they just get ignored. There's not a lot of room for jazz criticism in this country, but most of the people that review, and I do have a bee in my bonnet about this, they're failed musicians, everyone. Everyone. There's not one of them reviewing records that has any kind of credentials as a player. But they all have very high opinions, you know, and they're always looking to compare you to or not compare you, ignore you, and talk about the latest kid on the block or whatever, you know. Ronnie Scott used to say to me, what is it about all these young jazz musicians of the year awards? He says, why don't they have an old jazz musician of the year award? I said, I'd go in for it, you know. So would I, you know, yeah. But they're not really interested in that, you know. They just want some new guy with funny hair. You know, it doesn't seem to be much about the excitement of the music anymore. There's all this very cerebral. I mean, I've done workshops at the Royal Academy and some of the music colleges, and there's some incredibly talented musicians, but a lot of what they do I don't really think of as jazz, because it's incredibly cerebral. Nothing's really swinging, you know. I mean, that's the thing that it must have. There must be something exciting rhythmically going on. And I don't just mean, you know, having your calculator out because it's all in 7 or 11 or something, you know, it's all in these funny odd numbers. But, you know, just something that really swings, you know. I think that if you listen to a Scandinavian piano trio and then you listen to a New York piano trio, the difference hits you over the head like a sledgehammer. The New York trio are swinging like the Clappers. The Scandinavian one are all noodly doodling on the top of a Scandinavian mountaintop. You know, I know which I prefer. But then you do sound like a kind of crusty old fart when you say things like that, you know. But I do think that there is a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you know.
Great. So, I mean, it comes to kind of what the things you're thinking of, you know, the things you're doing at the moment, and also
I'm not doing very much at the moment, actually.
Things you probably want you might want to do in the future. Do you have any ambitions?
Well, I wouldn't mind a gig.
Yeah.
I mean, when you get to my age, you know, I'm 75 now, so, you know, it's hard to try and make too many plans. You know, you don't know whether you're going to be around next week, never mind next year or the year after. So I'm kind of taking it easy, really, you know. I mean, I'm still into playing. I'm still finding new things I want to play, although I haven't really written anything for a few years now. I've kind of gone off my own stuff.
Right.
Although having said that, I'm doing this 9-piece band that I have volunteers at Ronnie Scott's next month. And that's mostly my tunes, but arranged by the great flute player Gareth Locrane.
Oh, yeah, great, yeah.
And he's, if anyone has ever heard Gareth Locrane, he's the greatest flute player this country's ever produced, and a fantastic arranger. And he took all my little tunes and he took them from coming out of a Kodak Brownie and turned them into a sort of CinemaScope kind of production. It's just incredible.
What's the date for that?
My phone's in the repair shop. My
right.
diary's on my phone. I can't tell you. It's
But
something
it's in a
like the
couple of weeks.
16th or the 18th of August. Check it on Ronnie's website.
Great
But
stuff.
other than that, I'm just quite... And also, my wife, Zoe Francis, is a singer, and I work in her band, and she's preparing a new album at the moment. And she's very into... she's really into doing songs in 5/4 these days, you know. And that's not a normal thing that you'd have somebody singing. So we're doing Who Can I Turn To, you know, that song by Anthony Newley and Leslie Brickus. She's doing that in 5/4. So it goes like... etc., etc., you know. And she's also doing Embraceable You in 5/4, you know. She gets these crazy ideas. I have to arrange it for a band, you know. Etc., etc.
So there might even be a Jim Mullen vocal album.
No, that will never happen. That will never happen. In fact, she sings better. She sings it a lot better than I do. I was just kind of giving you an idea, but she does get these wacky ideas in her head, which I have to then translate into music, if I can. Apart from that, I'm happy just doing things with my organ trio and any gigs actually that come along. I mean, I enjoy playing. Some people still call me for gigs. Henry Lowther, who I saw on his birthday on Sunday, said, we've got this group called the Great Wee Band, which is what I once described one of our gigs as, and he's kept it as the name. I once said, this is a great wee band, you know. It was him, me, Dave Green, and Stu Butterfield, and it kind of stuck. And he's saying, we must get another gig together, you know, so we haven't played for ages, I mean, a couple of years probably, you know. But Henry's still a great player, and I love playing with him, you know.
He's on our list to get down.
Yeah,
here.
yeah, you'll get some great stories out of him.
Right.
He's amazing, you know. He knows everybody.
Brilliant stuff. I think we're kind of at that sort of time. So, Jim Mullen, everyone.
Thank you.
So we're going to end this live stream, and we're going to do the concert one. So you should have the link, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
They were hard questions.
But you did do the first